In the early 2010s, Wells Fargo was widely praised for a simple idea: deepen relationships with existing customers by offering more products per household. Inside the bank, this became a powerful performance story, sometimes framed as a cross-sell strategy meant to show that customers trusted the brand enough to consolidate their financial lives in one place. On paper, it sounded like a steady, customer-friendly path. One bank, many needs, one familiar team. But inside many retail branches, the strategy quietly changed tone. Targets became more specific, more frequent, and more closely tied to compensation and performance ratings. How many accounts today was no longer a casual question. It became a central measure of worth. Employees were expected to meet daily and weekly goals for new checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, and digital enrollments, often in an environment where missing numbers could affect schedules, bonuses, or even job security. Regulators later described how sales targets and incentive systems encouraged employees to open accounts without customer authorization in order to boost sales figures. This is where the story becomes less about one bad decision and more about a system that gradually stopped listening to its own warning signs. In a large organization, pressure does not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives as repeated reminders, dashboards, branch comparisons, and stretch goals that feel normal until they don't. Many employees still tried to do the right thing every day, serving customers with care. Yet, when a workplace ties identity to a number, it can create a hidden temptation. If I'm short today, I'll fix it tomorrow. When tomorrow comes, the pressure returns, and the gap feels even harder to close. Over time, some employees began opening deposit accounts or applying for credit cards without clear customer consent. In some cases described by regulators, accounts were opened and then funded by moving small amounts of money from customers' existing accounts, which could trigger fees or other consequences. The actions did not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes they were small, sometimes they were hidden in the noise of routine paperwork. But the impact on customers could be real. Unexpected charges, confusion, damaged trust, and time spent untangling problems they never asked for. A critical detail in this story is that these outcomes are rarely produced by one person acting alone. They are produced when an organization rewards certain results more loudly than it rewards certain behaviors. When opening becomes more valuable than serving, the meaning of success can quietly drift. Employees may feel they are choosing between honesty and survival, even when they entered the profession with genuine pride. By 2016, regulators concluded that the issue was widespread. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau announced a $100 million penalty, describing the practice as secretly opening unauthorized accounts, driven by sales incentives and targets. This was not framed as a minor paperwork problem. It was framed as a consumer harm problem. And that framing matters. It signals that banking is not just about transactions. It is about permission, clarity, and trust. From an educational perspective, the earliest lesson is simple but important. Culture is not a poster on a wall. Culture is what gets celebrated, what gets tolerated, and what gets repeated. If a system measures you every day, that system is teaching you what it truly values. As the public began to learn more, Wells Fargo's story shifted from a business success narrative to a cautionary tale about incentives. It became a case study in how performance pressure can create ethical risk, especially in consumer finance, where customers often assume the bank is acting only with their approval. The next chapters would reveal how long the behavior had been building, how many people were pulled into the problem, and how difficult it can be for a large institution to correct course once a numbers-driven routine becomes the default. Long before the story became national news, the signals existed, often in small, easily dismissed moments. A manager might notice unusually high account openings late in the month. A customer might call and ask why they received a card they did not request. A frontline employee might privately admit that the goals felt unrealistic. In a healthy system, these signals trigger curiosity and correction. In a stressed system, the same signals can be treated as inconvenience, something to smooth over so the numbers keep moving. Retail banking is built on repetition, daily routines, weekly scorecards, monthly results. That repetition can be a strength when it reinforces good habits, clear consent, clear documentation, clear follow-up. But repetition can also normalize the wrong thing when the organization's focus narrows to one measure. Over time, some employees began to feel that the job was no longer primarily about helping customers, it was about hitting a metric. Congressional research later summarized that Wells Fargo disclosed it had fired thousands of employees connected to the unauthorized account openings, a number often cited as 5,300. That figure is not just a statistic, it hints at the scale of the internal strain. When thousands of people are removed for behavior tied to sales goals, it suggests something more complex than a few isolated decisions. It suggests a workplace where many felt pushed into corners, where the right way to survive became distorted. A documentary lens also needs to hold two truths at once. Customers were harmed and trust was violated. Many employees were caught in a system where speaking up felt risky and meeting expectations felt impossible. Neither truth cancels the other. Together, they create the educational core of the case. Poor incentive design can injure both customers and workers. This is why governance matters. In a bank, governance is not only the board and senior leadership, it is also the chain of management decisions that translate strategy into branch-level reality. A strategic goal like serve customers more deeply becomes dangerous when translated into sell more products no matter what, especially if the system rewards the opening itself more than the customer's understanding. When the public conversation began, some defenders of the sales strategy argued that cross-sell is a normal banking practice. That is true in the abstract. Banks commonly offer multiple products, but the distinction is permission. The moment permission is missing, the activity becomes harmful and unlawful. Regulators were clear that accounts were opened without knowledge or consent. That clarity is part of why the story resonated. It was not a debate about marketing, it was a debate about authorization. Another lesson emerges here. Internal controls can fail when the organization assumes the system is working because revenue is steady. Controls are often designed to catch unusual spikes or obvious anomalies, but if wrongdoing is spread thinly across many locations, each piece can look small while the total becomes massive. That is how a large institution can be surprised by its own footprint. By the mid 2010s, the situation was no longer just an internal management issue. It was becoming a regulatory and reputational issue. Once consumers lose trust, the bank's core asset, credibility, erodes. And once regulators lose trust, consequences often extend beyond fines into long-term operational restrictions. The next part follows the moment the issue moved from internal strain into full public exposure, and how the first major enforcement actions set the tone for years of oversight. In September 2016, the story reached a turning point. Regulators announced a combined set of actions that made the behavior impossible to describe as a minor internal matter. The CFPB stated that Wells Fargo would pay a $100 million penalty, describing widespread illegal practice involving unauthorized deposit and credit card accounts opened without customers' consent. Congressional research summarized that the broader package at the time totaled $185 million, involving the CFPB, the OCC, and Los Angeles authorities. For the public, the numbers were startling, but the deeper story was about what the numbers represented. Years of decisions that prioritized output over consent. In a consumer bank, trust is not a marketing slogan. It is the expectation that nothing will be created in your name unless you ask for it. When that expectation is broken, every future interaction becomes harder. Customers begin to question statements, doubt mailers, and hesitate before accepting legitimate offers. Inside Wells Fargo, leadership faced a test that many institutions encounter after a major failure: how to respond in a way that is credible to customers, employees, regulators, and investors at the same time. The first response often includes apologies, reforms, and discipline. Yet credibility depends on whether the reforms reach the root of the problem: incentives, supervision, and accountability. From an educational standpoint, this is where we separate fixing the headline from fixing the system. A headline can be addressed quickly: announce policy changes, adjust sales goals, change leadership roles. A system takes longer. You must redesign metrics, rebuild monitoring, strengthen escalation channels, and ensure that employees who raise concerns are protected and respected. The 2016 enforcement actions also introduced a broader lesson about consumer protection. Regulators care not only about the direct act of opening an unauthorized account, but also about the downstream effects: fees, credit impacts, and the time burden placed on customers to resolve a problem they did not create. In other words, the harm is not merely financial, it is also emotional and practical. It is the confusion of seeing something unfamiliar on a statement. It is the uneasy feeling that your identity can be used without your approval. As the case became widely discussed, the public also began to understand that the issue was not just fake accounts as a phrase. It included unauthorized enrollments and services tied to account openings. The distinction matters because it shows how a single incentive, more products per customer, can ripple into multiple behaviors when oversight is weak. And then came a second realization. The reputational damage does not end when the first fine is paid. In many banking scandals, the first settlement is only the beginning. Once regulators dig in, they often discover related weaknesses, governance gaps, risk management failures, compliance blind spots. The organization enters a long season of oversight where each new finding reinforces the narrative that the original issue was not isolated. This is why the 2016 moment is best understood as the start of a multi-year accountability arc, not the end. The bank faced continuing scrutiny, and later actions would expand the picture, showing that the consequences of a culture problem can last longer than any single leadership team expects. In the next part, we follow how enforcement escalated into structural restrictions, especially the rare step of limiting growth, turning culture repair into a requirement, not a choice. A bank can often absorb a fine, issue statements, and continue operating. But when regulators believe the underlying controls and governance are not reliable, the response can shift from penalties to restrictions. That shift represents a deeper judgment. The institution must prove it can operate safely before it is allowed to expand freely. In 2018, the Federal Reserve imposed an unprecedented growth restriction on Wells Fargo, often described as an asset cap, limiting the bank's total assets until it improved governance and controls after the sales practices scandal. This was not simply a public reprimand. It was a structural constraint that affected strategy, competitiveness, and investor expectations. In practical terms, it signaled you cannot grow your balance sheet until you demonstrate that your systems are trustworthy. This kind of restriction teaches an important lesson about modern banking supervision. Regulators are not only punishing past behavior, they are also managing future risk. When an institution shows patterns of weak oversight, regulators worry that new products, new growth, or new complexity could reproduce harm in different forms. So the regulator uses the most direct lever available: operational limits. From a documentary perspective, this phase can feel quieter than the 2016 headlines, but it is often more consequential. A fine is a moment, a growth restriction is a season. At the same time, the bank faced the challenge of rebuilding internal culture. Culture repair is difficult because it requires changing what people believe will be rewarded. It requires managers to stop treating bad news as an inconvenience and start treating it as valuable information. It requires employees to trust that raising a concern will not lead to retaliation or isolation. And it requires leadership to demonstrate repeatedly that ethics is not a special initiative, it is the way performance is defined. This is where the educational angle becomes very practical. Institutions often say they want accountability, But accountability is not only discipline after harm occurs, accountability is also design. Designing targets that are realistic, designing compensation that does not encourage corner cutting, designing monitoring that detects patterns early, and designing escalation channels that protect truth tellers. The Wells Fargo case shows what happens when accountability is delayed. Once the organization is under heavy supervision, each improvement must be documented, tested, and validated. The bank must not only change, it must prove it has changed. In public reporting and regulatory summaries, another key idea emerges. Reputational repair is slower than reputational damage. Trust is lost quickly and regained gradually. For consumers, trust returns when everyday experiences feel stable again. Clear statements, predictable fees, straightforward service. For regulators, trust returns when audits show that the institution can detect and prevent problems before they become widespread. By this stage, the narrative also broadened beyond one scandal. The story became a broader question. Can a large bank rebuild control systems after a multi-year breakdown? The bank's next steps, leadership changes, compliance investments, and restructuring, would be judged not by promises, but by measurable outcomes. In the next part, we follow the accountability arc into the 2020 federal resolution, where the consequences expanded into a major settlement and a sharper public record of what the government believed happened. By February 2020, the Wells Fargo sales practices scandal reached another milestone, a large federal resolution that reinforced how seriously authorities viewed the conduct and its oversight failures. The U.S. Department of Justice announced that Wells Fargo agreed to pay $3 billion to resolve criminal and civil investigations related to its sales practices, including a deferred prosecution agreement. The DOJ also described related actions involving the SEC, including a $500 million civil penalty to be distributed to investors. This phase matters because it illustrates how a consumer harm scandal can evolve into a broader institutional accountability event. The public often first hears about customer impacts, unexpected accounts, fees, confusion, but investigators also examine what leaders knew, what controls existed, what was reported upward, and how the organization represented its performance and risks. When those questions raise concerns, the consequences expand beyond consumer refunds into corporate-level settlements. A deferred prosecution agreement is especially meaningful in educational terms. It signals that the government is focusing on organizational behavior and future compliance, not merely collecting money. It is a structured way of saying, we are watching what you do next, and we expect measurable change. It turns reform into a monitored obligation. For a bank, this is a reputational crossroads. Many customers will ask, if it happened before, how do I know it won't happen again? The only convincing answer is a pattern of consistent, boring reliability over time. Fewer surprises, clearer consent, better service recovery, and transparent communication. This is also a key moment to understand the trust machine concept in finance. Banks do not run only on capital, they run on confidence. Customers deposit money because they believe their accounts will be handled with care. Investors buy shares because they believe reported performance reflects reality. Regulators grant operating freedom because they believe controls work. When confidence weakens, the institution's freedom shrinks. The Wells Fargo case shows how expensive it is to rebuild that confidence. The cost is not only the settlement number, the cost includes years of management attention diverted to remediation, ongoing compliance spending, reduced strategic flexibility, and the slow work of repairing relationships with customers and communities. From a documentary storytelling view, the scandal also highlights a human lesson about incentives. A goal is not neutral, a goal shapes behavior. If a goal is paired with fear, fear of missing targets, fear of losing status, fear of disappointing a manager, it can produce short-term results and long-term harm. Healthy performance systems balance ambition with safeguards, and they treat customer permission as a non-negotiable boundary. As the 2020 resolution landed, another long-term dynamic continued. Regulators and the public wanted proof that the bank could handle not only this specific issue, but also the broader operational weaknesses that allowed it to persist. That proof would be demanded again in later years, including through large consumer redress actions and ongoing oversight. In the final part, we follow the story into the next wave of accountability and the longer arc of reform, showing how the scandal's legacy shaped the bank well into the 2020s. A major scandal rarely ends with one settlement. It leaves behind a long shadow of remediation, reviewing past customer impacts, repairing systems, and rebuilding governance so the same patterns do not return in new forms. In December 2022, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau announced another significant action, ordering Wells Fargo to pay $3.7 billion related to widespread mismanagement across auto loans, mortgages, and deposit accounts, including consumer redress for millions of affected accounts and a civil penalty. While this action covered issues beyond the original unauthorized account openings, it reinforced the broader theme of the Wells Fargo story. When foundational controls and culture weaken, problems can appear across multiple business lines, and remediation becomes multidimensional. From an educational viewpoint, this is the deeper lesson. A culture problem is rarely confined to one product. If employees believe that results matter more than process, that belief can migrate. It can influence how complaints are handled, how fees are applied, how exceptions are managed, and how quickly issues are escalated. Over time, regulators look for patterns, not just incidents. Then, in June 2025, the Federal Reserve announced a major milestone. Wells Fargo was no longer subject to the growth restriction imposed by the board's 2018 enforcement action. The Fed stated that Wells Fargo had met the conditions required for removal of the restriction. Public reporting described this as the end of a particularly strict form of punishment that had limited the bank's growth for years, tied directly to the need for improved governance and risk management after the sales practices scandal. In documentary terms, this moment functions like a quiet conclusion to a long chapter, not a celebration, but a recognition that structural reform, while slow, is possible when it is demanded, funded, and monitored. It also reflects how long institutional repair takes. The original scandal came into wide public view in 2016. The growth restriction was imposed in 2018. The restriction was lifted in 2025. That timeline shows that rebuilding trust is measured in years, not weeks. The bank's long repair period also illustrates how accountability can become layered. Frontline accountability, correcting customer records, refunding fees, strengthening consent practices. Management accountability, changing metrics, training, escalation, and oversight routines. Governance accountability, board supervision, risk frameworks, independent testing, and regulator reporting. For viewers, the most valuable takeaway is not the headline number of accounts or the size of a fine. The takeaway is how easily normal business pressure can drift into consumer harm when incentives are poorly designed. The fake account scandal became a widely taught case because it connects everyday workplace choices to large-scale outcomes. A small shortcut multiplied across thousands of employees becomes a systemic failure. And it offers a final, calm but firm lesson for any organization, financial or otherwise. Ethics is not only personal character, ethics is also architecture. It is how goals are set, how rewards are distributed, how bad news travels upward, and how leaders react when the numbers look good but the signals look wrong. That is the enduring story of Wells Fargo's unauthorized accounts, not a single moment of failure, but a long chain of design choices, followed by a long, expensive, and highly supervised effort to rebuild trust.